Should we bring in General Keane?
Let's do that.
Let's bring in retired four-star General Jack Keane, Fox News senior strategic analyst, former Army Vice Chief of Staff, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. General, great to see you as always. In fact, you spent some time on this base, this very base.
Yeah, about 4 years. I was an infantry paratrooper there. One of the best assignments I've ever had. It's an adventure, to be sure.
What's your take as we get ready to see President Trump greet the Russian President Vladimir Putin here in Alaska?
Yeah, well, I think, the conclusion is pretty obvious. Putin called for the meeting, and it's likely what's motivating him. He wants to make certain these tariffs and sanctions do not fall on him, and he wants to come and talk about avoiding that and what it would take to avoid that. Obviously, the president's number one way to avoid it is go to a ceasefire. Putin has delayed that, for 6 months. I think there'll likely be a fair amount of economic discussion here, and you can see who the players are that the president has brought along with him to help facilitate that discussion, likely at a lunch meeting. But yeah, I think both carrots and sticks are at play here. Putin knows full well that Trump is holding the cards here on tariffs and sanctions, something he doesn't want to see, and you have outlined the serious economic issues that Russia already is beset with. I mean, we've got inflation in double digits. We got interest rates hovering around 20%. The growth of the economy that was spurted with going to a war footing and pumping money into the defense industrial base, that has slowed down now, so growth is only about 1%, so it's stagnating. Their debt is a 30-year high, and next year their defense industrial base will not be able to keep up with the demands of the battlefield. That's just a fact. And he's paying high bonuses to recruit soldiers to fight, and based on our analysis of what's happening on the battlefield, they're showing up remarkably with only 2 to 3 weeks training. And that's one of the reasons why the casualties are so high on the Russian side. Poorly trained and poorly led. So Putin has a lot of issues here that he likes to change the narrative and tell the world that he's really winning this war and he'll win eventually, etc. Yes. So he's coming into this, and I think the pressure is on him. And President Trump is waiting to see what he has to say and what kind of move.
This is President Putin's plane that has landed, and I just wanted to reference that sound. Was fighter jets that escorted it down as it landed here in Alaska. There is also a huge contingent of F-22s and B-2s in position here. It is a show of military force for the U.S. as the Russian president and his plane lands at Elmendorf. Richards.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of political theater, I would say, happening at this moment. Obviously, the stakes are very high for human beings on the ground in Ukraine and the recognition of their country. And we see this meeting about to happen, General Keane, and while we see it in recent days, we have watched repeated missiles incoming to Ukraine. The war is very much still going on. Efforts by Russia to soften up certain areas that they hope will be part of what they're calling New Russia. As we watch Putin's plane here and we wait for him to deplane, your thoughts on the war on the ground right now, sir?
Yeah, well, Putin, during these negotiations with President Trump, and I think this is one of his major frustrations, remember, the president wants to stop the war genuinely on the human side, to stop the killing. He said it time and time again. And during those negotiations, Putin escalated the war against the Ukrainian people. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles firing into major cities, targeting civilians, which is a war crime. And why is he doing that? To put pressure on Zelensky from his people to end this war and make major concessions to him. Remarkably so, we've had ISW analysts down on the front lines and in these cities talking to people, and they are steadfast about they don't want to see concessions made that are favorable to Russia. They do want to see an end to the war. That's understandable. So does Zelensky, but not at their expense and the expense of their people in these territories. That's where they draw the line. And that is really quite remarkable and something to be said for the courage and steadfast of the Ukrainian people, and certainly their soldiers are nothing short of remarkable. A penetration tactical one made recently. Media's making far too much out of it. This was somewhere around 50 people in 5 or 10-man groups on motorcycles using thermal blankets at night to hide from detection, and they penetrated tactical lines. It was an infiltration, as we call it, not an assault. The infiltrate in where there are openings, Ukraine has stopped that. They're counterattacking. Russians were not able to bring up their main units to follow these reconnaissance forces. Too much being made out of that.
We have the stairs going up to the Russian plane, and obviously the meeting continues on Air Force One with the senators and the governor of Alaska as President Trump is still on the plane. So you'll probably have maybe a simultaneous disembark here to the red carpet in front of the B-2s and the F-22s. General, you talked to the Ukrainians. What do you think the sense is as they watch this spectacle? Because it is that, to Martha's point, as you look at Air Force One, it is a political drama. Zelensky is not here, but the President Trump, is trying to get to that second meeting. What do you think their thought process is of this?
Well, they know that this is likely a seminal moment, and they absolutely applaud what the president has done. And that is, one, obviously providing military assistance to him, taking the American taxpayer off of it. They're not getting involved in that, but something we should have done a long time ago, and coming down hard on threatening sanctions and tariffs. So they believe the president has got their back. They certainly want a positive outcome here. They want to see a ceasefire. He has said he's willing to go to an unconditional ceasefire for 6 months now. That's the outcome they would like to see. If it takes more than one meeting to get there, I think that's fine with the Ukrainians. You know, President Trump is going to see what Putin has to say and what kind of concessions he's willing to really make here, and are they real? Or is he just going to filibuster him like he's done before, with a lot of words, a lot of promises that he doesn't keep, and a lot of flattery about the president and why he's so significant as a president, and why he wants to have an economic relationship with him and a much better geopolitical relationship with him. You know, he's the key president of the 21st century, and I want to have this relationship with you. So one of the major things I think that Putin wants to keep here is his relationship with President Trump. And the one thing he doesn't want to have happen is President Trump put the hammer down and walk away and slam him with the tariffs and sanctions. He's going to work very hard to prevent something like that from happening.
So it's up to President Trump, General, to assess whether or not there is a genuine effort that has changed in some way from Putin to want to get to a place where they can have a ceasefire. And we know that Putin, believes that the people of Ukraine are one with the people of Russia. He doesn't really want Ukraine to even be a country. Doesn't want them to have the sovereign lines around the country. Doesn't want them to be able to really defend themselves. So President Trump has expressed his frustration with being what he says tapped along by this president of Russia, who's been around for 25 years. He's going to be really, his monitor for BS, is going to be very high, I would imagine, in this meeting, General.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're really at strategic odds here. What is Putin about here? Remember, everything started in 2014 when Yanukovych, who wanted to be aligned with Russia, but the people wanted to be aligned with the EU and NATO, and they ran him out of there. The people ran him out after he fired upon them. Hundreds of thousands demonstrated him, and where did he flee to? Russia. That precipitated Putin to get involved because he does not want Ukraine looking to the West. And he wants to take over Ukraine and control it. And the reason is a couple of them, but a major reason is Ukraine is a major country. Educated people, thriving economy in terms of the breadbasket of the world there, in their agriculture and manufacturing capability, as we know, also minerals. He doesn't want that country to be a thriving, democratic, capitalistic country at his doorstep, putting huge pressure on his people and the way of life that he is imposing on them. That is the catalyst for him moving there. And he certainly doesn't want it being aligned with the EU and with NATO for political and military security. That is why he took Crimea and annexed it. That is why he moved into the Donbass in 2014. And Obama kind of gave him a free hand to do it. Obama actually even put pressure on Ukrainian leadership to take the deal, Minsk I and Minsk II. And Putin, they were very favorable to him, and he violated those ceasefires as he had in Syria as well. He's been at this a long time. He wants control of Ukraine. He's going to put his own stooge in there to run that government, and he will use Ukraine to expand into Eastern Europe. That is his strategic objective. That is completely at odds with President Trump, who wants to end this war. For Putin, the war is the means for him to achieve that objective, unless Zelensky and Ukraine capitulates. He certainly would take a surrender, but that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So strategically, we are very much at odds here.
The picture is really something. You see it on the screen. The planes are only a few yards apart, and the staircases are only a few yards apart, and the Russians are actually on the left side of Air Force One, as you see the two doors opening there, and the leaders will likely come out simultaneously or one after the other, but very close together. If we have the other shot of the B-2s, I'd love to take that, because it is amazing that this red carpet goes through this phalanx of B-2 bombers, General. And obviously the symbolism is there about U.S. military might, but it comes after that 36-hour bombing run that was just made on Iranian nuclear facilities. That, I remember you telling me on set, had a message not only for Iran and for the Middle East, but also for Russia and China because of the military might. They're going to walk through the middle of B-2s on the way to this meeting.
Yeah, I love it. Those F-22s they're the interceptors that go out and meet the Russian bombers that are trying to, at least get close to the air interdiction zone of Alaska. And this happens on a routine basis. There is absolutely no doubt that President Trump has additional leverage because of the decisive decision he made to attack Iran and to end their nuclear program, and within 24 hours end the war. Putin saw that, President Xi saw that, the North Korean Kim Jong-un saw that, and so did obviously all of our allies and partners. That gives him added leverage in what has taken place here. And they know when he says tariffs and sanctions are coming, they know he means it. And why does he mean it? That was decisive evidence of it, because Israel attacked on the 61st day after Trump said to the Iranians, you got 60 days to make a deal with me. On the 61st day, Israel attacks, and then 11 days later, the United States attacks to end it all. Yeah, he's got their attention for sure that he means business here.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.